I hope you are still awake for this last talk. So, right now I want to teach you how to build a NativeScript-Vue app. It's actually a very simple recipe. It only has 2 ingredients, which is kind of the maximum number of ingredients of all my recipes. And so, you grab a big bowl, then you add Vue.js, then you sprinkle with some NativeScript, you mix everything up, and voila, you have your NativeScript-Vue. Thank you very much, this was my talk. No, I'm just kidding. No. I was not actually leaving, this was just a joke, so, okay. I thought he was going to steal my microphone. Okay, I'm just kidding. I really want to introduce NativeScript-Vue, and mostly I want to set your expectations correctly if you want to try this technology. Because expectations are very important. Imagine that you travel to France and you hear about this amazing restaurant, and you look at the menu, everything is very, very expensive, but eventually you pick something and you get this. You'll probably not be very happy with this. No, yeah, it's great. But also, imagine that you go for a run. You run 15 kilometers. You arrive home starving and sweating, and your mom calls you to the table, and the dinner is this. You will probably not be very happy as well. So, which meal is better? Yeah, actually, it depends, like most things with programming. So it's kind of a matter of expectation. And I really want to set you with the right expectations for the rest of this talk. So, who here are Vue developers? Okay, most of you. Who has ever worked with NativeScript? Okay, just a couple of people here, and that's great because this talk is exactly for web developers that may ever need or want to enter in the native mobile development. So, just before we go in the technology, if you are a web developer and you start building native apps, you really have to change the way that you think about building your app. You have to think mobile. That means thinking like a mobile developer. And these are my 3 advices. Firstly, you have to think small. The screen is smaller, so you cannot just scale your web application and make it fit in a small screen, because people will not be able to read it. You don't know where people will be when they are using your application. They can be in the bus and their hands are shaking. Also, the interaction with the device is very different. On a web application, you use a mouse, you look through a screen, and so there is quite a bit of distance between the user and the application. But people are holding your application when they use the mobile device. They touch your application with their fingers, and this is a very different experience. So interactions are very physical. Google came up with the material design based on these principles. They want to make the user interface feel material. So also, each moment has to be special. On a web application, we are kind of used to when we submit a form, the page reloads, or when we click a link, everything will be kind of messed up for a couple of seconds, and that's fine. Of course, as we have heard many times today, our expectations about web applications have been rising, which is good. But building a mobile application actually forces you to go that path and to actually care about those details. So it's again kind of two different meals and two different expectations. The one on the left can be like your mac and cheese, your normal web application. I have built several of those. While a mobile application is like a gourmet dish. So the portion is much smaller, but everything has to be designed perfectly. Each bite of that dish on the right has to be a different experience, has to fill your palate in a way that mac and cheese does not. So kind of mobile development is like building, is like making a gourmet dish. But of course, you may be a web developer and you already love building small experiences. Maybe you like to spend hours working on an animation. Maybe you spent countless days working on the performance of your app. If you are this kind of developer, then you are cut off to be a mobile developer, because that's what you will do a lot. So if you are excited with animations and interactions and making moments feel special, you should try mobile development. Yeah. So, maybe you are asking, who is this guy? How does he know all this? Okay, I started as a web developer for many years, worked in several different technologies, built a couple of native applications as well. Currently, I'm working in irc.com, so we are trying to make IRC great again. And I'm working on making a mobile app with NativeScript-Vue, which is kind of the mobile counterpart of Kiwi IRC. Kiwi IRC is a Vue app for IRC. Okay, so it's a web client built with Vue. I am also a progress dev expert, mainly for my contributions to the NativeScript-Vue community. So you are a web developer and you want to start building native applications. You have first to understand that you have two platforms that you have to target your code to. So you have Android and iOS. Thank God Windows Mobile didn't make it. Oh. Okay, but you still have two. So they are quite different. So for Android, you have to know Java or Kotlin. You have to install Android Studio, and you have to know about the Android SDK, study it, learn it. And the same thing kind of for iOS. You have Swift or Objective-C. If anyone here ever used Objective-C, I'm sorry. I used it once for one project. I finished the project, but I cannot say I know Objective-C. It's too weird to, well. So you have to install Xcode, and you have to learn the UI kit. So a lot of things to learn about, and you have to basically have two separate projects. So whenever you see an application that has an Android and an iOS version, most likely it's from a company that has two different development teams. One is working on Java, and one is working on Android, and one is working on the iOS. But you don't want to go this path because it's too hard. Thankfully, there is something called NativeScript. So this is what the website tells about NativeScript. It's an open source framework for building truly native mobile apps with Angular, Vue.js, TypeScript, and JavaScript. So NativeScript provides a way to build cross-platform native apps using web technologies. So kind of HTML, kind of CSS, and JavaScript. And the really interesting part here is this truly native. This means that when you build your NativeScript app under the hood, you get a truly native app, meaning that the user interface is rendered with native components. So your app will be truly indistinguishable from a native app. And you can do this from one code base, because with NativeScript you build for both platforms at the same time. Also, it's pretty cool that you can use any framework that you like, Angular, Vue, of course, TypeScript and JavaScript, but also there are currently community efforts for a React version and a Svelte version, and they are both working right now. They both have documentation, so it's worth checking out. So, continuing with NativeScript, how does it compare to a normal hybrid? Hybrid, I mean, like a Cordova app or a PWA, progressive web app. I would say that comparing these with NativeScript is like comparing apples to pears. It's not comparing apples to oranges, because they are not so different, but it's kind of comparing apples to pears. So, in an hybrid or a PWA, you are using like native web technologies, and so your application actually runs in a browser, and you build it with web components that you can style to make it look like a native application, but it's never a native application. And with NativeScript, you kind of use the same technologies, so JavaScript and XML, because we don't actually use HTML components, and CSS. There is not like a one-to-one match between web CSS and NativeScript CSS, because there are properties that only make sense on NativeScript and properties that only make sense on the web. But as much as possible, the properties are the same, so it feels very familiar. So, okay, more differences. There is no DOM in NativeScript. So the way that you build your user interface and access the components it's different. There is actually no DOM. And NativeScript builds or renders into native components. So these are some of the core NativeScript components. You can see there buttons, labels, switch, slider, text field, activity indicator, date picker, list view, and alert for small pop-ups. And as you can see, the components on the left are a bit different than the components on the right, but that's actually a good thing, because Android is different from iOS, and NativeScript actually tries to respect the native platform. So you can build your app and it feels really native. So Android users will have that Android feeling, iOS users will have that iOS feeling. Of course, that you can then style everything up, and if you want to make those buttons completely the same, you can do that. So you get the best of both worlds. Also, you don't use divs to compose your layout. You use layouts. There are currently 6 types of layouts. Flex layout, which is kind of an implementation of the Flexbox, but with a NativeScript. The dock layout, which is pretty cool to push components to the side. The stack layout, that's just stacks components. The wrap layout, that you can add components, and then when there is not enough space, the next component is wrapped to the next line. The grid layout, which is by far the most powerful layout. I use it whenever possible. It's also very performant, kind of the CSS grid, but, well, not quite. And the absolute layout, where you can just place elements based on absolute positions. So it's different, but it's actually so much easier. When I started being a web developer, I was building layouts with tables. Yeah, I did that. Then we had that float left and float right nightmare. Everything was a mess. We had to use so many tricks, for instance, to center a div. I mean, come on, I just want to center a div. Okay. So right now we have, of course, other solutions, but even so, building an interface with these layouts is so much better than building an interface in the web. It's much easier to place things where you want and to adjust the layout to the size of the screen. It's awesome. Also, we don't actually have routing on an application. We have navigation. We have to be very careful how we move from one page to another, so that's kind of different. But so far, I have talked about things that you can find on any other cross-platform native framework, like React Native or Xamarin. So, so far, I didn't show anything new about NativeScript. But this is where NativeScript really stands out of the crowd. That is because NativeScript okay, this stopped working. Okay. Now it's working too well. Okay. Okay, NativeScript proxies all native APIs. So you can use the entirety of the native APIs from JavaScript. For instance, I have this small, kind of stupid example. So this is a JavaScript function to square a value, and if it's Android, I am calling the math function in Java. So, and I am passing the element. And for iOS, I am actually calling the C function to make the power. So I know this is a simple case, but it already shows a lot of what NativeScript does. It actually detects what is the native function that you are trying to call, and it will call that function. But also it will convert from the JavaScript types to the primitive types on Java and on Objective-C. But it actually does much more than that, because on Java and Objective-C, you have things like objects and structs and enums and functions and methods. But NativeScript makes this translation. It's called marshalling, and does this very well. It's awesome. But this is a kind of a stupid example, because I can square a value with JavaScript. But this shows that I can really dive into the native code. So if I want to tweak something natively, I can just research the documentation for Android and iOS, and use the APIs that I find there directly in my JavaScript. I don't have to open another IDE, code, compile something, and then bring that something to my application link, and then test. It's a nightmare. I can do that from JavaScript without even noticing, because it's so fluid. So, of course, but we don't actually go to the documentation. We just go to Stack Overflow to see how stuff is done. Okay, that's how we all do it. But I have an example, the text shadow. So the NativeScript label does not implement text shadows by default. But the underlying native components do. So I went to Stack Overflow, and I researched how to add text shadow to Android, in Android and on iOS. And so this is what I found. So right here I am grabbing like a reference. Yeah. It's not showing up? Okay. Oh my God. Okay, this is hard. Okay, so so right here I am grabbing a reference to the underlying native component, and then I am calling this function set shadow layer. This is then a function on the Android SDK, and so then I make some transformations from pixels to device independent pixels. I've even called some enums in Android, which is cool. So this is how I implement that using NativeScript. For iOS, it's kind of the similar thing. I grab a reference to the underlying native component, in this case the UI label, and then from this moment on, I am just setting properties on the native component directly, even using some weird macros that exist on Objective-C and things like that. But yeah, as you can see, it's very easy, and I can do that in my code. So I actually did this, and I started playing with shadows, and I built this demo application just to play with these shadows. It's on the playground if anyone wants to check it out. Okay, so far I have only been talking about NativeScript by itself, but I'm here to talk about NativeScript-Vue. And I really think there is great power in building NativeScript-Vue component applications. So what are the ingredients of a NativeScript-Vue app? This is your normal NativeScript-Vue component, and it's probably very familiar. Looks very familiar, right? So you have your template. The only difference is that instead of HTML components, you have like NativeScript components. Then you have your script, and then you have your styles. You can use CSS, scopes. Everything looks very familiar, except those weird properties that only work on NativeScript. But yeah, it's fine. So it looks very familiar. It feels very familiar. If you are a Vue.js developer, moving to NativeScript-Vue will feel like you are at home. But there is something even more awesome about using NativeScript and Vue. The thing is that NativeScript has a property system where the CSS properties can also be written as attributes. So you have this CSS property right here that sets the background color to blue, and every property is translated directly as attributes. This means that with Vue, we can make this attribute reactive, and it works. So right now I just added a column before a background color, and then I set it to a variable. And this is awesome because now it's very easy to change the user interface by playing with these variables, the internal state of the component. So I created some examples, for instance, this shadow example that I already showed, but also I used an animation library just to show that it's possible. These are only GIFs, so you cannot see how fluid they are, but actually on a real device, you will see that the animations are smooth enough. So yeah, it's cool, just to play around. So, using a NativeScript, using Vue.js, we are kind of used to use a set of libraries out there, and Gusto just mentioned a couple that we all use. So we are kind of used to just grab things and put it in our basket, and everything just works. Can we use them on NativeScript-Vue? Let's see some. Okay. Firstly, Vuex. Can we use? Yep, we can use Vuex. It's just plays with data, and we can import it. There is nothing, absolutely nothing to it. You just use it exactly on your, as in your regular Vue app. Can we use Vue Router? Nope, we cannot use Vue Router because Vue Router is very focused on routing. So and routing works very differently on a mobile app. Actually, there was initially an effort to make Vue Router compatible, but it was a mess because they are fundamentally different things. So, for instance, this internationalization library. Yep, it only works with data. I am even reusing the same translations on the mobile, on the web app. I am using those same translations on my mobile app, and it just works. Awesome. Transitions. How many of you here use transitions or know what transitions are? Okay, this is like a very special component that creates animations when an element enters or leaves the screen. So it kind of reacts to view ifs and view shows. And can we use it? It's kind of weird, but we do. Although this plays with the user interface, transitions actually only call animations when some element shows or disappears. So all we have to do is implement those animations according to the NativeScript APIs, and it just works. I even have another stupid example here showing transitions with CSS and with JavaScript. It's awesome. It works. And not only this, but almost everything you see out there works. Axios, tweezing, which is like that animation library. Also, Vue.js that Damien talked earlier. Yeah, it works. Everything works because as long as it does not touch the user interface, or as long as it does not have any dependency on the DOM, if it's like a pure library that only plays with data and things like that, it will just work. But cooking is not just about having the best ingredients. You also need a good kitchen, a good set of appliances. So what are our appliances with NativeScript-Vue? So firstly, we have live sync and hot module reload. This means that you can install your app on a mobile device or on the simulator, and you change your code, and those changes are immediately reflected on your app. It's kind of magical even. We can use the Chrome DevTools to debug our JavaScript. So we just open the Chrome DevTools. We can set breakpoints. We can inspect the values in the JavaScript objects, etc. Everything works. Also, we can use the Vue DevTools, which is also awesome. We can use Vue DevTools to inspect the internal state of components and even the internal state of Vuex. So we are pretty good in a pretty good situation developing a NativeScript-Vue app. But also, NativeScript has a couple of other cool things. For instance, Sidekick. Sidekick is an application that you install next to your project. And you can use it to manage dependencies and also to make builds. So you have a nice UI to create a build. And it's also integrated with Cloud Builds. So you can make an app and the build is made in the cloud, in some server. So it's actually the only way I know to make an iOS app using a Windows machine. So you have this as well. The playground, this is like code sandbox, but okay, not quite. But for NativeScript, so you have your IDE, you can write your application, and then it's very easy to make it work on your device. So it will show up a QR code, you scan it, and the application is automatically downloaded and boots up on your device. And also live reload and hot module reload keeps working. So if you start changing the code, it will be immediately reflected in your app, which is kind of awesome. I really like the playground to make like small examples of code or small snippets or to test something very simple. It's great. There is also the Convey Studio. This is like a paid application to build mobile apps with drag and drop. But after that, you can actually go to the source code and change if you want. So it's also good to make prototypes, but not just that, because you can connect it to real backends, and so even build applications with this. I never used it, but yeah, it's out there if you guys like it. So, what else do we have? We have the plugin market, which is kind of this big refrigerator where we can grab lots of pieces of code. So, in NativeScript, you have a plugin system, which is like a piece of code that you can use in our app, much like Vue.js libraries. So, for instance, that shadow example that I showed earlier, I converted it to a plugin. So now if you want to use text shadows in your project, all you have to do is come to this page, type in text shadows, and install the plugin on your application and use it. So yeah, and there are currently more than 1,000 plugins, so chances are that if you need something more direct to the metal, you probably will never have to actually use the native APIs, because chances are that someone already did that for you and wrapped in a nice plugin that you can use. So only on extreme situations that you actually use the native capabilities of NativeScript. You also have lots of resources to learn about NativeScript and NativeScript-Vue. There's this one, nativescripting.com, which is a learning platform for NativeScript, and they currently have some Vue courses. Also, there's this application that's actually a workshop where it teaches you how to build an application from start to finish in that link over there. And then, of course, there's a Stack Overflow. Sometimes I open Stack Overflow, try to find something for me to answer, and it's hard because there are a couple of folks that consistently search for questions regarding NativeScript, and they answer them very fast. So I want those points, but I cannot because of them. So, but it's pretty cool because that means that if you have any problem, you can go there. And the community Slack. So the NativeScript community Slack is probably one of the most friendly community Slacks that I have ever been into. And I am also there, mostly answering questions about NativeScript-Vue. So if you have any problem, you can go there, and the NativeScript core team hangs in there all the time, so you get really good answers for your problems. So, can you use NativeScript-Vue? Is it good for you to use this technology? How can you convince your boss that NativeScript-Vue is a good solution? So, firstly, you actually use your Vue.js skills. So if you are a Vue.js developer, building apps with NativeScript-Vue feels very Vue-y. I mean, everything works as you would expect. Single file components, computed props, events, slots, scoped slots, even the most advanced features in Vue, everything works as expected. Also, if you already have a Vue.js application, chances are that you may reuse some or even a lot of that code in your NativeScript-Vue app. That's what I am doing in my case. So we have this Vue.js web application, and I am reusing a ton of code on the mobile version. So everything that touches the state of the app and even small utilities that are already built and working, I don't have to implement those. So that's great. And I am excited for Vue 3 because it will bring more possibilities to share code because it's easier to decouple functionality from components, which is awesome. Also, NativeScript is very safe because you know that you'll never reach a roadblock, because at any point you can dive into the native code. So you will never be stumbled by something that NativeScript cannot do, because at that point you just do a bit of research and see how you would implement that using Java or Objective-C, and just add that to your code, and you are good to go. Also, you should know that NativeScript is sponsored by Progress, which is like a big development company, and they are not going anywhere. So if your boss is kind of concerned about enterprise level support, you can get it with NativeScript. And that's it. I hope that you are excited to try NativeScript-Vue if you ever need to develop a native application. And those are the places where you can find me. And thank you very much.